World News Today, brought to you by the Admiral Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's Smart Set. By shortwave broadcast, direct from important overseas stations, as well as leading news centers of our own country, CBS correspondents are waiting to bring you a complete report from the world's political and battlefronts. But first, here's Doug Edwards.
A Finnish communique reports that 600 Russian planes bombed Helsinki last night, causing fires and heavy damage. The raid lasted nearly 12 hours, the longest and heaviest air attack of the war. Red armies have broken into the outer defenses of Pskov and are threatening that key communication center. And the Russians are only 59 miles from Ostrov, a rail and highway junction connecting Pskov with Warsaw and Berlin. And around in the southwest Pacific, American destroyers have bombarded Keviang, New Ireland, while our planes have pounded Rabaul again. Now for news of the fighting in Italy and an interview with one of our fortress gunners, Admiral Radio takes you to Naples. John Daly reporting.
This morning, the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces announced the almost complete destruction of the Messerschmitt aircraft factory in last Friday's great raid on the proofening suburbs of Regensburg, Germany. It was the climax of a four-day offensive coordinated with the 8th Air Force based in Britain. Staff Sergeant Raymond J. Merrick, a full-blooded Sioux Indian from Fort Cotton, North Dakota, was something of an authority on that Regensburg raid. He took part in it as tail gunner in a flying fortress named the Blitzing and shot down 4 enemy fighters. Regensburg culminated a career as tail gunner, which began with a raid on the Palermo barracks in Sicily last June, and which includes a Cook's tour to Rome, Vienna, Neustadt, Toulon, Innsbruck, Athens, Sofia, Bologna, and most way stations. Before we go into that Regensburg raid, was that the only operation in the four-day offensive last week that your outfit took part in?
No, we went out 3 times. The day before we went to Saïd. I had a tough time getting the flag damage fixed up so we can go to Regensburg on Friday. Well, we got off the ground all right about 9 o'clock.
And 93 German fighters were knocked down on that raid. Must have been pretty tough.
It's the toughest I've been on in 50 raids. 40 German fighters hit us about 11:15. About 10 minutes later, 20 more joined them by the time we got to the target, there was over 100 coming all over the clock. They were like flies. They come up right through the formation like they didn't care whether they got hit or not. The helmet behind us was broken up pretty quick. And we stuck out like a sore thumb. 3 or 4 Germans was coming all at once. I'd take time and stay with him. I'd keep shooting until they burn up. Twice I thought they were going to hit our tail. I got both those guys. They were Messerschmitt.
Were there any rocket shooting jobs?
Yes.
We regret that the signal from Naples is not up to broadcast standard. The Italian battlefronts are still rather quiet today. Our troops repulsed 2 small German attacks in the casino sector, and other German stabs, in an effort to slip behind our beachhead position south of Rome, have also been turned back. It's raining on the casino front and on the beachhead. German planes dropped glider bombs on the beachhead port of Anzio Friday night, but there's no word of any damages. Headquarters reports that 4 of the bombers listed as missing after the heavy attack on Regensburg have now returned to base. And it's also announced that the double blow against Regensburg, with bombers from both Italy and Britain attacking, caused the most complete destruction of the Prufening aircraft factories, which had been turning out from 200 to 250 fighter planes a month. And now, once again, here is Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Radio.
Today, Admiral Corporation pays tribute to the Army Airways communication system. Global war requires a global network of radio stations. The Army Airways communication system operates as an individual unit under the Army Air Forces Command and is responsible for all airplanes in motion, taking off, landing, getting messages in flight, weather reports, and all ground-to-air and point-to-point communications. To do all this, AACS maintains radio systems in all 48 states of this country and in 52 foreign countries. They divide the entire world into 23 regions of operations. Here is a striking example of the job being done by the Army Airways communication system. Exactly 8 days after American forces had established the first beachhead on one of the New Georgia islands, a complete radio station had been installed and was sending out information vital to our attack in the whole area. Equipment for these stations, such as Admiral bills, must be able to take it, must operate perfectly in all temperatures, from the sticky, wet heat of the Solomons to the numbing cold of Greenland. Admiral-built radio equipment is serving on all invasion fronts, war-proved, battle-tested. The greatly expanded production facilities of all Admiral plants will continue to turn out the tools of victory until the last battle is won. With the world at peace again, this greater Admiral production will convert to building the new and better Admiral radio, America's smart set. Now, here once again is Doug Edwards.
For the news here at home, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Washington. Don Pryor reporting.
America got a new kind of money today. The new red and blue fiber ration tokens went into use this morning. From now on, the little dime-sized discs will be used to make change for red and blue stamps in Ration Book 4. And all of those stamps, incidentally, now have a flat value of 10 points each. In New York, Wendell Willkie jumped into the Roosevelt Congress tax fight today. He called the president's veto message violent and ill-tempered, and he insisted that the nation's real tax problem can't be solved by dramatic resignations and over-sentimental reconciliations. The big story here now is the increased pressure from Selective Service headquarters in the White House for a speed-up in the induction process and for immediate review of draft deferments. The House Military Committee is expected to back up the president on that score this week with a demand for the induction of all, or at least most, of the younger deferred men. Chairman Doughton of the House Ways and Means Committee offered a bright hope to the nation's taxpayers today. The tax form we've been struggling with recently, he says, may be the last one we'll ever have to make out. His committee is going to start work immediately on a tax simplification bill, and he hopes to have it ready for action in the House within 2 weeks. I return you to Admiral Radio in New York.
The Tokyo Radio today came up with a story on why the Jap fleet has avoided combat with American warships. The reason, according to Tokyo, to confuse American amateur strategists. And now for a report on the fighting in the Central Pacific, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Pearl Harbor. Webley Edwards reporting.
Out of the fast-moving events of the past week in the Pacific, these things now become evident. Japanese naval, air, and military strength, and the all-important supply facilities spread so thinly over the vast area from Paramushiro in the north through the Central Pacific to Rabaul in the south that our forces can walk in and give the enemy a sound, smashing defeat at any point of his defenses. And the Jap has got to take it. Our Pacific fleet can probe deep into the vitals of the Japs' inner defenses, as they did at the Marianas Islands, 1,250 miles from Yokohama and Tokyo, and wreck his bases right under the noses of the Jap fleet. The once mysterious Jap naval stronghold at Truk, called the Japanese Pearl Harbor, may not be the strong naval base it was supposed to be. For some reason, the Japs appear not to have capitalized on a magnificent harbor, perfectly formed and beautifully protected by reef formations, for an ideal naval base of great strength, but instead have relegated it to the status of a staging base for relaying supplies and fueling planes on the ferrying trip south and east. The once mighty Rabaul on New Britain Island has been given such a going-over that it has become virtually impotent. Reported 790 Jap planes have been destroyed there by Allied flyers since mid-December. American destroyers have now bombarded Kavieng in New Ireland for the third time. The capture of Eniwetok in record time sealed up the Marshall Islands. This farthest west Marshall's Atoll was a staging base for supplying the far-flung group of islands containing more than 20,000 Japanese troops. More than half of these were killed by our amphibious forces, 8,000 at Kwajalein, 3,000 at Eniwetok. Admiral Nimitz estimates 10,000 remain on Wochi, Maloylap, Mili, and Jalu. They are hopelessly isolated, constantly bombed, shelled, and battered. They are in much the position our troops were in at Bataan, except they have no one to fight. They must just sit there and wait for the bombings and plan what they'll do when the food runs out. Coral atolls are barren places without natural food supplies. Eniwetok now points the way to bombings further into the Jap defenses. Both Eniwetok and Kwajalein are being rapidly built up as offensive bases. As has long been expected, the Jap fleet has pulled further back. And unless the new Navy leaders decide to change their pattern, the Jap fleet will stay well back out of the way of our ranging Pacific fleet. And if so, the Central Pacific Ocean has become an American pond, a vast one, but ours to move in as we please. The blows at Truk and the Marianas indicate that we please to move in it
quite a long way, and rapidly. This is Webley Edwards at Pearl Harbor, returning you to Admiral Radio in New York. Dispatches from Chile and Uruguay quote travelers returning from Argentina as saying that Army officer supporters of the deposed President Ramirez are considering an uprising to return him to the presidency. And now let's hear a report direct from the situation itself. Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Buenos Aires. Hugh Jenks reporting.
CBS Buenos Aires. The uproar caused abroad by the withdrawal of President Ramirez from the active exercise of his post and his delegation of the executive power to General Farrell has occasioned nothing but surprise in official quarters here. They insist that the entire procedure had its precedent in the similar retirement from the presidency of Roberto M. Ortiz and his replacement by Dr. Castillo. That any question of recognition of the government should be raised in Washington or anywhere else is regarded by the new regime as just a bit unusual. As on the occasion of the rupture of relations with the Axis and other major developments here, the changes effected in the government were carried through in complete calm. Most of the residents of Buenos Aires did not know what had happened until they picked up their newspapers on Friday morning and read of the withdrawal of General Ramirez and the accession of General Farrell to what Farrell himself has called the temporary occupancy of the presidential post. The calm that existed then has continued through the weekend. Although Colonel Juan D. Perón announced that there would be no immediate changes in the cabinet, at least 2 additions are likely to be made during the coming week. The Foreign Ministry has been vacant since the resignation of General Alberto Gilbert. It was filled temporarily by Admiral Benito S. Suedo, who was also the Minister of the Marine. But Admiral Suedo resigned from his post as Minister of Marine, although General Farrell is reported to have requested him to reconsider his decision. These questions and many others must wait for the events of the coming week to be decided. What happens during the next few days undoubtedly will give us a clearer idea of the future course of the new regime. And that is just about all that I can tell you of the situation here at this time. This is Hugh Jenks of the United Press in Buenos Aires. I return you now to New York.
You have just heard a report on the Argentine situation direct from Buenos Aires. But from Montevideo, across the border in Uruguay, comes word that a majority of Argentina's army officers and armed forces favor General Ramirez. And travelers reaching Uruguay and Chile say these men are only waiting word from Ramirez to stage an uprising. These officers are said to have been meeting the last few days, and it's suggested they may decide to strike a counter blow and risk the shedding of blood in order to put Ramirez back as president. British newspapers today are enthusiastic about the results of the week-long air attacks on Germany. For a direct report and an interview with another of our fighting men, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS London. Larry LeSueur reporting.
This has been the greatest week in the history of air warfare. Virtually every important German aircraft factory has been heavily damaged in round-the-clock bombardments by the American Air Force and the RAF. There are those who believe that this past week may have been the decisive week of the air war in the West. In the studio tonight is Lieutenant Ralph N. Phillips of Kansas City, Kansas, who trained at Mather Field, California. As the navigator of a Marauder of the 9th Air Force, he's probably made more bombing trips over the enemy coast than any other American. And the most unusual thing about Lieutenant Phillips' career is that he never even got a scratch. He's just been lucky. Lieutenant Phillips, I think you're the first American to make 50 bombing missions over the enemy coast in a Marauder. Have you ever set foot in Europe yourself?
No, I haven't, Larry. I guess I could hardly draw a map of France before I came over here 8 months ago. But now I know pretty nearly every little village in France and the Low Countries as well as I know Kansas.
Yeah, I noticed you rattle off the names of those little French villages as though you were a native. What does it look like from your seat in a Marauder, Ralph?
Well, I don't think we've ever come low enough to see people walking around, Larry. As a matter of fact, we understand there are no Frenchmen within 15 miles of the coast. They've all been moved out by the Germans. It seems to be pretty deserted. You don't see any smoke coming from the chimneys, and only once in a while you sight a train.
Lieutenant Phillips, how about those special installations you've been bombing? The Prime Minister has said that he believes the Germans have rockets or robot airplanes on the other side. What do they look like?
Well, we're up pretty high, Larry. And these targets are so small that they're very hard to identify. The Germans have camouflaged them very well, putting them near the edge of a wood or village so that they blend in with the rest of the landscape. You've got to watch out for signs of new construction. Little concrete houses and a kind of long concrete runway from which, I suppose, they intend to launch the rockets or whatever they are. We've had pretty good results hitting them, especially where we bombed them before. There are lots of places in France now where you can see plenty of craters, and some spots look like no man's land.
Lieutenant Phillips, what would you say the difference was between your first missions over France 8 months ago and the present time?
Well, in the first place, we have about twice the number of marauders now as when we started. We have found the right altitude to bomb from, and 8 months of experience have made our pilots very confident. Our formations are so good now that the German fighters rarely tackle us, especially if we've got Spitfires along. The marauders have moved the enemy's front line back about 50 miles in 8 months. We've made them evacuate their airfields on the coast, but in return, they've moved in more flak against us. All this special training we've had on the rocket targets has made our bombardiers so sure of themselves that when the invasion begins, we'll be ready to give our troops the closest possible support. 8 months' experience over the French coast has made the B-26 Marauders ready for anything.
Well, thank you very much, Lieutenant Phillips. You've just heard the first American to complete 50 bombing missions over Europe. We return you to New York.
The Women's Army Corps is writing one of the brightest pages of this war. And today, Admiral Radio would like you to meet one of the girls who is helping to do this magnificent job. To introduce her, here is Bill Slocum, Jr.
Journalistic tradition insists upon a description of the interviewed by the interviewer. Therefore, I am pleased to report that my subject for today has a pair of beautiful blue eyes and everything that goes with them. Furthermore, my subject is a sergeant in the United States Army, and she has just been named one of the 10 best WACs and will shortly depart on a cross-country tour that will be a nice break for her and the country. Margaret Ritchie is her name, and she's from Hickory, North Carolina. There's a handsome ring glittering on her left hand. So let's first ask her about Mr. Ritchie. Margaret?
My husband is a paratrooper in the Southwest Pacific.
Then he's been a busy little man for quite some time, hasn't he?
Yes, he's seen quite a bit of action. He's been over for the last 16 months.
Do you outrank him, Sergeant Margaret?
Indeed not. I'm very proud of his gold bars.
Margaret, he's a lucky man. Any second lieutenant who can keep the love of a sergeant should be a colonel. But when we were talking yesterday, you told me your husband had been gone 16 months, and you'd been a WAC 15. Any connection?
Yes, there is. I went back home after he left, and frankly, I was bored to death. Plus the fact I kept hearing that a large WAC corps would help get the boys back home. So I joined the WAC.
Has it been fun?
No, not always. But it never has been dull. I feel the WACs are doing an important job, and I'm pretty proud to be a part of that job. And the WACs has been good for me.
You mean made you healthier or something?
No, not healthier, but smarter. After you've been in the WAC a while, you forget all the girl junk, like not speaking to someone or having your feelings hurt at the drop of a hat.
You mean you can't be a WAC and a dog in the manger?
Well, that's close.
It's as close as we're going to get. Sergeant, I've heard some people say the WAC uniform is too military for girls. I think the phrase is, it doesn't do anything for you.
Well, it's no miracle working, Mr. Slocum. I like a trim uniform. It's not at all bad.
Indeed, it's not. And if it were cut like a sack of Idaho potatoes, it would still be something to wear with great and real pride. Thanks, Sergeant Margaret Ritchie, for coming up and talking about the WACs. If we gave any of our civilian sisters an idea, they can run, not walk to the nearest recruiting station. If they can, they should, because they certainly are needed. Now, Doug Edwards.
For an interview with the Navy commander of a medium bomber squadron which saw action at Tarawa, Admiral Radio again takes you to CBS Washington, Don Pryor reporting.
Commander Eddie R. Sanders came home the other day after more than 6 months in the South and Central Pacific. He went out there last June at the head of the Navy's first combat squadron of Ventura medium bombers to enter the Pacific. At first, they were scouting for Japs over the Gilberts and across great stretches of ocean in between. Then came Tarawa. Commander Sanders and his squadron moved right in and began flying reconnaissance north among the marshals.
It wasn't quite that fast, Don, but almost. We landed at Tarawa about a week after the main assault was over. Some squadrons of fighters were already there.
Well, can you describe the scene when you got there, Commander?
Well, the island looked like a city dump and smelled like a slaughterhouse. The Marines and native labor gangs were still burying bodies. There was hardly a level spot on the island. It was just a mass of rubble. Everything was pulverized. There wasn't a green thing in sight. The place was littered with mashed and broken coconut logs, shattered concrete, wrecks of airplanes, machines, and other equipment.
Well, how did you land on a place like that?
That's where the Seabees came in. They swarmed into terror with their bulldozers, scrapers, all sorts of equipment while the bullets were still flying. Before the battle was over, they had made part of the Jap flight strip usable for our fighters by temporary repairs. It wasn't very good, but it worked. We needed more space for our bombers. That's the reason we had to wait a few days. They kept right on working all the time, day and night. The Japs would come over at night, bomb the runway. The Seabees always had it ready for us to take off before daylight. And don't forget the ground crews. I don't know when they ever slept. They seemed to be going all the time, arming, servicing, repairing the planes. Their spirit was an inspiration.
Well, were there any Japs around there when you got in?
Yes, but practically all of them were dead. It was a full month before they were all finally cleaned out. They kept digging out of pillboxes and dugouts, caved in by shells, bombs, and even bulldozers.
Did you spend all your time there on research and reconnaissance, or did you get to do any bombing?
We were scouting all the time till last December when another Ventura squadron was sent in. Then they took over the reconnaissance. We got a chance to hit the Japs instead of just looking at them. We made 2 raids on Nauru and 1 on Jaduit.
Well, how about losses, Commander? Did you lose very many planes?
No. In all the time we were out there, we lost only 10 planes altogether. At least 8 of them were by enemy action. We lost only 3 crews, 12 men, 6 officers. We would have lost a lot more, but the Ventura is a fast plane for a bomber. We used to chase their scouts, but we had enough speed to run away from their fighters if necessary. One of our planes was jumped one day by 6 Haps. That's the latest Model 0. Another was jumped by 4 of the Japs' newest fighters. Both walked right away from them. Incidentally, we did get a few chances to hit back. A couple of outstanding examples. Ensign Chuck Yezel, my youngest pilot, shot down one of the newest 4-engine Jap flying boats. Lieutenant Jack Polk fought a 1-plane battle against 3 Jap ships right inside of Milley Airfield. He sank 2 of them, stopped the other one dead in the water.
Commander Sanders' whole squadron is back here for a rest now before going back out again. I return you to Admiral Radio in New York.
In the Southwest Pacific, our planes and ships are still working out on Jap positions. For the 3rd time, American destroyers have bombarded Kevieng on New Ireland. No Jap planes or ships interfered with the attack. We sank 1 of their ships and left 2 more afire, and yet another vessel was left sinking off nearby New Hanover Island. And now, once again, here is Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Radio.
There are thousands of people who are fortunate enough to own an Admiral Radio phonograph combination with the automatic record changer, know and will vouch for the trouble-free enjoyment found in the playing of a program of either 10 or 12-inch records without fuss or bother. Admiral's high fidelity and lifelike reproduction of recorded masterpieces is a treat to any music lover. And the convenience of Admiral's Slide Away seems almost miraculous to users. With the Admiral's Slide Away, there is no lid to lift. You simply open the cabinet doors, and the complete phonograph turntable and Admiral automatic record changer emerge out in plain view, waist high, easy to reach. Admiral's Slide Away is one of the important reasons why, in pre-war days, Admiral Corporation gained leadership in the automatic record changer field. Admiral's wartime job makes impossible the building of any automatic record changers for the present. But when victory is a reality, you'll be proud to own an Admiral, America's smart set, from the modern factories of Admiral Corporation, world's largest manufacturer of radio phonographs with automatic record changers. The appearance of service personnel on this program does not constitute an endorsement of our product for the armed services. World News Today is brought to you each Sunday at this hour by the Admiral Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. Be sure to listen again next Sunday when Admiral brings you World News Today by shortwave, direct from leading news centers of the world. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.
The WBBM Air Theater, Wrigley Building, Chicago.